April 15, 1943. At 25,000 feet above the Belgian coast, Oberleutnant Hermann Keller of Jagdgeschwader 26 spotted unfamiliar silhouettes moving in from the west. These were not aircraft he recognized, large single-engine fighters unlike anything in his identification manuals. His combat report, preserved today in the Bundesarchiv Military Archive, records the very first Luftwaffe encounter with Republic P-47 Thunderbolts in combat. What Keller saw defied German expectations. The American fighters were climbing and holding formation at altitudes previously thought impossible for U.S. planes, an estimated 12 aircraft flying steadily above 7,000 meters. Moments later, Keller witnessed something that would shock Luftwaffe pilots for the rest of the war. The lead P-47 lit up with what looked like an unending flash. It wasn't the usual 4 or 6 guns, but 8 heavy machine guns firing together in perfect synchronization. The result was a devastating pattern of firepower no German pilot had ever faced. Keller's wingman in a Focke-Wulf 190 was hit nearly 40 times in less than 2 seconds. The fighter didn't catch fire or explode, it simply broke apart, shredded into fragments by 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds. That day, Major Donald Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group scored the P-47's first aerial victory, giving German pilots their first taste of America's firepower doctrine. The P-47C Thunderbolt carried 8 Browning M2, 50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. Together that was 6,400 rounds every minute, over 100 bullets every second. With 350 rounds per gun, a P-47 could sustain fire for nearly 33 seconds, a staggering figure in aerial combat. This marked a dramatic change in the nature of air warfare. The Luftwaffe had long believed that cannons were the future of fighter armament. Their standard 20 meters MG 151 or 20 cannon fired explosive shells, designed to destroy with just a few accurate hits. German pilots trained to rely on precision, using deflection shooting to place 1 or 2 shells exactly where needed. Major Günther Rall, who went on to score 275 victories and became the 3rd highest ace in history, later explained, "We believed machine guns were obsolete. Cannons were the natural evolution. Precision and accuracy were everything." The American philosophy was entirely different. Rather than relying on pinpoint accuracy, the Thunderbolt unleashed overwhelming firepower. At ranges of 200 to 300 yards, the P-47's convergence created a destructive 8 by 12-foot kill zone. Colonel Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, credited with 27 victories, summed it up simply: "We weren't trying to make surgical shots. We were putting so much fire out that nothing could survive in front of us." The numbers told the story. A P-47 carried 2,800 rounds total, 350 for each of its 8 guns. Each armor-piercing incendiary round weighed 171 ounces. A 15-second burst meant firing over 1,600 rounds, more than 171 pounds of metal and incendiary material. By comparison, a Bf-109G carried just 150 rounds for its single 20mm cannon, with 2 13mm machine guns holding 300 rounds each. The German fighter could fire its cannon for only 6 to 7 seconds before running dry. A P-47, in contrast, had enough ammunition for multiple extended engagements. The first official mission for P-47s came slightly earlier, on March 10, 1943, when the 4th Fighter Group flew its initial combat sortie over France. That mission ended without combat due to radio problems, and the Germans never realized what they had narrowly avoided. The Thunderbolt had been designed specifically for high-altitude superiority. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, equipped with a turbo supercharger, produced 2,300 horsepower at heights where German engines struggled. At 25,000 feet, the same altitude flown by B-17 bomber formations, the P-47 maintained power and maneuverability that German fighters could not match. Luftwaffe doctrine emphasized combat below 20,000 feet, where their designs performed best. The Bf-109G's Daimler-Benz DB605, even with MW-50 methanol water injection, had difficulty at extreme heights. The Focke-Wulf 190A, deadly at medium levels, became sluggish above 22,000 feet. Major Egon Mayer, commander of 3, JG2, and credited with pioneering head-on attacks against bomber formations, admitted in his tactical reports, "Above 7,500 meters, the advantage shifts entirely to the Thunderbolts. They move freely while our controls feel frozen. They strike from above with terrible firepower and climb away before we can react. By mid-1943, German intelligence finally confirmed Republic Aviation's production numbers, and the results were alarming. The Farmingdale factory, along with the new plant in Evansville, Indiana, reached output levels that seemed beyond belief. At peak capacity, Republic built 840 P-47s per month, 28 every single day. The Evansville plant alone rolled out 6,242 Thunderbolts. By comparison, all of Germany's fighter production combined peaked at 2,177 aircraft in September 1944, spread across multiple designs. One American company was producing nearly half as many fighters as the entire Reich. Oberst Josef Priller, Geschwaderkommodore of JG-26, at first dismissed reports of U.S. output as Allied propaganda. But after facing ever larger P-47 formations later in 1943, he reviewed those reports again and wrote in the margins, "If anything, these figures are conservative. We are fighting industrial warfare on a scale beyond imagination." The disparity went deeper than numbers. Each Thunderbolt required over 17,000 individual parts, all produced with modern assembly line efficiency. Its 8 Browning M2 machine guns alone cost more than entire German fighters. Yet America built 15,186 P-47s by war's end, making it one of the most produced U.S. fighters in history. On August 17, 1943, during the first Schweinfurt raid, the Luftwaffe saw the Thunderbolt in full force. From that point on, German pilots knew they faced an opponent with not only advanced technology, but also a level of industrial support they could never hope to match. For the first time, P-47 Thunderbolts escorted B-17 bombers deep into German airspace using belly tanks. Pilots of JG-1 and JG-26, expecting the bombers to be unescorted after their little friends turned back at the normal range limit, instead found themselves facing 240 Thunderbolts holding tight formation. The battle that followed showed just how destructive concentrated P-47 firepower could be. Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland of JG-26 later reported, "The Thunderbolt's guns don't just damage aircraft, they make them disintegrate. We watched skilled pilots vanish in clouds of wreckage. No bailout, no chance of survival, just instant destruction from concentrated fire." The psychological shock was immediate. Luftwaffe pilots who had spent years perfecting careful tactics suddenly faced an aircraft that removed the value of those maneuvers. Instead of working for a firing position, Thunderbolt pilots could simply aim and unleash overwhelming bursts of fire. P-47 pilots developed tactics that maximized these strengths. The most feared was the high-altitude bounce. Diving from 30,000 feet at nearly 500 mph, they would fire short, devastating bursts, then use their momentum to climb back to altitude before opponents could react. German pilots called these attacks death from above, knowing they had no reliable counter. The P-47's energy advantage was unmatched. A dive from 30,000 feet to 15,000 feet gave enough kinetic energy to climb back to 25,000 feet, without even using full power. German fighters already straining to reach such altitudes simply could not match this vertical dominance. What was once thought of as a disadvantage, the P-47's heavy weight, more than 14,000 pounds when loaded, became a lethal advantage in diving combat. German pilots who tried to escape by diving found that Thunderbolts closed the distance with ease, their 8 guns ripping through targets in seconds. The ammunition load of the P-47 gave Americans an additional edge. With 350 rounds per gun, they had flexibility in combat German pilots could not imagine. They could fire ranging bursts, adjust aim, and still have enough to fight multiple opponents in a single mission. German fighters, by contrast, carried only 150 to 200 rounds for their main cannon, along with limited machine gun ammunition. Every burst had to be carefully judged. Ammunition anxiety became constant. Missing shots meant wasting irreplaceable resources. This imbalance created a psychological gap. Americans flew with confidence, Germans with caution. The production behind this disparity was staggering. The Lake City Ordnance Plant in Missouri produced around 6.5 billion rounds of .50 caliber ammunition during the war. That single factory's output alone could have supplied every P-47 ever built with over 400,000 rounds, enough for 140 complete ammunition loads per aircraft. D-Day, June 6, 1944, demonstrated the Thunderbolt's dominance beyond any doubt. The Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties over Normandy in the entire day, while the U.S. 9th Air Force flew more than 2,000 Thunderbolt sorties. German pilots who reached the invasion beaches were met by walls of American fighters that seemed endless. The odds were crushing, over 20-1. When combat did occur, the results were brutal. The Luftwaffe lost 35 aircraft that day, with P-47s credited for 27 victories. Thunderbolts also revealed their devastating power in ground attack. Armed with bombs and rockets, they cut down German reinforcements trying to reach the beaches. But it was their strafing runs with 8 machine guns that created lasting terror. A single Thunderbolt could annihilate a vehicle column in one pass, tearing through armor, destroying engines, and killing crews with frightening efficiency. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was in crisis. Replacement pilots were being sent into combat with as little as 10 hours of fighter training, while American pilots often had over 200 combat hours. This imbalance in skill, combined with the P-47's overwhelming firepower, turned many air battles into massacres. New German pilots rarely stood a chance. Even poorly aimed American bursts filled the air with so much fire that survival became nearly impossible. Veteran instructors reported that entire classes of new pilots were wiped out in their first encounter with Thunderbolts. The numbers reveal the scale of the disaster. German pilots who began training after June 1944 had less than a 15% chance of surviving 5 missions. Against P-47 specifically, the survival rate dropped below 10%. Entire squadrons were destroyed in single battles, replaced by less experienced pilots who lasted even shorter times. Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's surprise attack on Allied airfields on January 1, 1945, showed just how far the balance of power had shifted. Although the Germans achieved surprise and destroyed many aircraft on the ground, the retreat was catastrophic. As they turned home, P-47s from the 365th Fighter Group scrambled from Metz, intercepted them at low altitude, and cut entire formations to pieces. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and 143 pilots killed that day, losses from which it never recovered. The Americans lost only 16 aircraft in air combat, a kill ratio unlike anything seen before. Even the arrival of the Me-262 jet failed to restore balance. While jets could outrun Thunderbolts in level flight, they were exposed during takeoff and landing. P-47 pilots developed tactics to wait near jet bases and attack when the aircraft were most vulnerable. The Thunderbolts' guns shredded jets just as easily as piston fighters when they caught them in these moments. Several of Germany's best jet pilots were killed this way. Walter Nowotny, however, was not one of them. He was shot down by P-51 Mustangs on November 8, 1944, not P-47s as is sometimes misreported. By the end of the war, production numbers told the full story of America's industrial strength. Republic Aviation built 15,686 P-47s in total. At peak capacity, factories produced 840 Thunderbolts per month, 28 every day. The Luftwaffe never had a chance to match this scale. Every P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 Browning M2 machine guns. To arm all Thunderbolts built during the war, 125,488 guns were required. American industry also turned out more than 12 billion rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, giving every aircraft virtually unlimited combat loads. By comparison, Germany's entire fighter production between 1939 and 1945 reached only about 33,000 aircraft of all types. Ammunition shortages meant that German pilots often flew with half loads, and by 1945, fuel shortages limited missions to only 15 to 20 minutes. Meanwhile, P-47 pilots had enough fuel for 2 hours in the air. The result on German morale was severe. Luftwaffe medical officers even documented what they called Thunderbolt neurosis, where pilots developed involuntary stress reactions to any sound resembling the roar of 8 synchronized machine guns. Many survivors showed trauma similar to artillery shock. German veterans adopted avoidance tactics aimed at survival rather than combat. They targeted only damaged or isolated planes, avoided battles above 20,000 feet where P-47s had the advantage, never attempted head-on attacks, and disengaged immediately when Thunderbolts appeared. These weren't strategies to win, only to stay alive. Major Günther Rall, who ended the war with 275 victories, gave an important account of these encounters. On May 12, 1944, he lost his left thumb when attacked by P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group, led by Hub Zemke. After the war, Rall admitted, the P-47 could maintain higher speed at altitude and dove much faster than the Bf-109. We learned to respect not just the aircraft, but the firepower philosophy it represented. General Adolf Galland, with 104 victories, also wrote about the psychological effect. He explained that the 8 guns of the P-47 sent a clear message. America would win through abundance, not efficiency. Every burst said, "When we have so much we can afford to waste it destroying you." That message, he noted, was even more damaging than the physical losses. Johannes Steinhoff, who survived the war with 176 victories and later became a NATO commander, also witnessed this shift in air combat. Although his writings didn't single out the P-47 directly, his service with JG-26, JG-77, and JG-7 placed him in constant contact with American firepower. The Thunderbolts' impact wasn't limited to air battles. As a ground attack aircraft, it created even deeper trauma. The same 8 guns that tore through fighters devastated German vehicles, trains, and troop formations. A single P-47 could disable a locomotive in one pass, its firepower tearing through armor and steel. German troops, even hardened veterans from the Eastern Front, often broke under strafing runs. The sound of 8 guns firing together became synonymous with certain death. Vehicle columns caught in the open were left as miles of wreckage. By 1945, newer P-47M and P-47N variants pushed performance even further. The P-47M, powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800-57C engine with water injection, produced 2,800 horsepower and could exceed 470 mph. Only 130 of these were built, but they represented the peak of piston fighter technology. Late-model P-47s were also equipped with the K-14 computing gun sight, which calculated range and led automatically. With this system, even less experienced American pilots became deadly accurate. Combined with 8 guns, it erased Germany's last advantage in deflection shooting. Germany's worsening fuel crisis magnified the disaster. By late 1944, new pilots had almost no training time. They entered combat with just a few hours in fighters, while American pilots logged over 200 combat hours. The fuel disparity meant Germans fought in constant anxiety, calculating whether they had enough to return to base, while P-47s enjoyed freedom to climb, dive, and pursue. The imbalance of training, technology, and resources meant most encounters could hardly be called combat at all. The results speak for themselves. In Europe, P-47s were credited with 3,752 air-to-air victories. The destruction or damage of 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 68,000 motor vehicles, and 6,000 armored vehicles. Losses totaled 3,499 P-47s to all causes, with 1,020 to enemy fighters and 2,479 to flak and operational issues. In aerial combat, the Thunderbolt achieved an exchange ratio of more than 4:1. The psychological impact carried beyond the war. During the Korean conflict, when West German advisors working with NATO watched footage of F-84 Thunderjets attacking ground targets, several veterans had visible stress reactions. They told NATO leaders that American doctrine was not about seeking balanced fights, but about overwhelming destruction through sheer industrial power. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe itself admitted defeat in its final assessment, recognizing that the P-47 symbolized the end of traditional fighter combat. Skill and maneuvering no longer decided battles, mass firepower did. The 8 guns of the P-47 had not only destroyed German planes, but also erased an entire philosophy of air warfare. German pilots had entered the war believing they were knights of the air, relying on individual ability and precision. They ended the war knowing that the future belonged to nations capable of producing overwhelming firepower. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its 8 50 caliber machine guns, became the symbol of that lesson. Post-war historians confirmed this conclusion. Dr. Williamson Murray wrote that the P-47's armament represented more than just firepower. It embodied the American approach to war. Where Germany relied on precision and efficiency, the United States relied on abundance and scale. The Thunderbolt showed that air combat had been democratized. Even a novice could be as deadly as an ace when armed with walls of 50 caliber fire. In the end, the P-47 not only crushed the Luftwaffe but also reshaped the entire meaning of aerial warfare. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt's production highlights the true scale of America's industrial mobilization. Republic Aviation, once a small company that built only 39 aircraft in 1939, expanded to producing 840 fighters every month by 1944. That single company's growth outpaced the entire increase of German aircraft production during the war. A new plant in Evansville, built from empty land in 1942, employed 28,000 workers at its peak, with 40% of them women. Many of these workers had no prior experience in industry, yet they built combat aircraft so reliable that mechanical failure accounted for almost no losses in the field. Each Thunderbolt contained 305,000 rivets installed with pneumatic tools unavailable in most German factories. American assembly lines were so efficient that jobs taking German plants days could be done in just hours. This speed and quality translated into overwhelming numerical superiority in Europe's skies. The logistics behind the Thunderbolt were equally impressive. Ammunition production went far beyond the 6.5 billion, 50 caliber rounds manufactured at the Lake City Ordnance Plant. Additional facilities in St. Louis, Denver, and Salt Lake City produced billions more. This ensured P-47 pilots never faced the ammunition shortages that plagued German flyers. In France, forward airfields received daily deliveries greater than what German squadrons received in an entire month. Every Thunderbolt sortie launched fully armed, while German fighters increasingly went up with partial loads. Pilot training revealed the same imbalance. By 1944, the United States was training 100,000 pilots every year, with specific programs dedicated to P-47 operations. New American pilots arrived with more than 200 flight hours, including 50 hours in Thunderbolts. In contrast, German training collapsed from 250 hours before the war to less than 50 by 1944. Fuel shortages meant many German pilots fired their weapons for the first time in real combat. The result was not equal battles but one-sided encounters. The impact of the Thunderbolt went beyond numbers. Its 8-gun firepower influenced American doctrine throughout the Cold War, where overwhelming force replaced precision as the core of military thinking. German officers who later joined NATO acknowledged that the P-47 had taught them a harsh truth. Modern war was about production power, not individual skill. The contrast in survival rates proved this point. American P-47 pilots who completed their tours had about a 90% chance of survival. German pilots in 1944 and 1945 had survival rates below 30%. This wasn't about bravery or ability. It was about the mathematical certainty of facing overwhelming firepower. Young German pilots with fewer than 10 hours in fighters were thrown against American veterans with hundreds of combat hours in aircraft, carrying 8 heavy machine guns. The Luftwaffe's fighter force was not simply beaten, it was systematically erased. The P-47's strategic role went far beyond individual victories. Thunderbolts secured air superiority that allowed the bombing campaign to cripple German industry. They protected bombers that destroyed fuel plants, causing the shortages that grounded German squadrons. On the battlefield, Thunderbolts disrupted German operations by striking reinforcements, vehicles, and supply lines. During the Normandy campaign, the Wehrmacht could not move in daylight without suffering devastating losses from P-47 attacks. This inability to maneuver was a key factor in the Allies' success. In German post-war military culture, the Thunderbolt became a symbol of American material strength. Veterans coined the term Thunderbolt mentality to describe overwhelming force in action. The phrase 8 guns entered their vocabulary as shorthand for unbeatable firepower. Military studies concluded that German tactical excellence could not overcome America's industrial-scale firepower. For German pilots, the shock of seeing P-47s shred their fighters with 8 50 caliber machine guns revealed a deeper misunderstanding of modern war. They had believed in quality over quantity, skill over mass, precision over saturation. The Thunderbolt showed them that industrial democracy's ability to produce overwhelming firepower outweighed totalitarian efficiency. The 15,686 Thunderbolts built, equipped with 125 488 machine guns and supplied with billions of rounds of ammunition, represented more than weapons, they represented a philosophy. America could afford to put double the firepower on every fighter, because industrial abundance made it possible. German pilots learned this lesson in the hardest way, through daily encounters with aircraft that destroyed them repeatedly and almost casually. The Thunderbolt didn't just win air superiority over Europe. It demonstrated that in an age of industrial warfare, the nation with the greatest production capacity would prevail. German pilots' surprise at the P-47 was ultimately surprise at the very nature of modern conflict. They had prepared for duels of skill, and instead faced an industrial machine that processed them with 8 guns firing over 100 rounds per second. In those converging streams of tracers lay the entire story of World War II, America's ability to mass-produce overwhelming force and deliver it anywhere it was needed. Survivors came to understand they had faced not just superior aircraft, but a superior production philosophy. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its 8.50 caliber guns, was democracy's answer to totalitarianism, not through ideology, but through industrial mathematics that no amount of courage or talent could defeat. By war's end, the German pilots' shock had turned into recognition. They had seen the future of warfare, and it came in the form of a thunderbolt, delivering American industrial supremacy one devastating burst at a time.